Team Plasma never wanted Pokemon set free. It wanted them handed to one man, and every speech about liberation was cover for a single person's monopoly on power. The boy raised to lead that movement believed he was chosen, and no one around him planned to let him find out what he actually was. Getzius. Team Plasma spent years screaming one message across Unova: free your Pokemon. Every banner, every speech, every trembling recruit on a street corner sold the same idea: total liberation, zero exceptions. And the entire time, the man who built that message from scratch was working toward a world where exactly one person on the planet still got to own a Pokemon: him. That is not a contradiction that slipped through the cracks. That is the plan working exactly as designed. Publicly, Ghetsis Harmonia Gropius was nobody special, just one voice among the 7 sages, an old man in robes standing slightly behind the curtain while other faces did the talking, nodding along like he was just another believer. Privately, he was the entire operation. He founded Team Plasma. He wrote its scripture, every line of it. He built a movement convincing enough to make thousands of ordinary trainers release Pokemon they had raised since childhood, walked away from partners they had trained for years, all while he kept his own team fully stocked and battle-ready in the background. The liberation was never the goal, it was the delivery mechanism. Get enough trainers to give up their Pokemon voluntarily, and the ones still holding a team suddenly hold all the power in the region. Simple math and cruel math. Ghetsis did that math early, and he built a 7-man shadow cabinet just to run it. Every piece of the con points at the same target. The endgame documented across Black White, Black 2, and White 2 was never regional influence or generic evil team domination. It was narrower and colder than that. Ghetsis wanted to become the single legal Pokemon user left standing in the entire world, with every other trainer disarmed by their own conscience, unable to fight back without betraying the exact ideal they had been sold. That takes a special kind of cruelty, the kind that does not need an army so much as it needs believers, which is exactly why he did not build this scheme alone in a bunker somewhere. He built it inside a family. Ghetsis raised a boy as his own son, filled that boy's head with every word of the liberation gospel before the boy ever understood it was a script, and then pointed him at the world as the final piece of the con. The founder gets the monopoly. The adoptive son gets used as the proof that the whole thing was righteous, walking around as living evidence that Plasma meant what it preached. That is the real machine underneath Team Plasma, not an ideology, a parent turning a child into the most convincing liar in Unova, without the child ever knowing he was lying. But a con this big needs a face the public can love, and the founder's own face was far too cold for that. So he built one. He raised one. From a boy who genuinely believed every word Plasma preached. Eon A King who could talk to his subjects and still didn't know he was owned. That's N. He wasn't playing a role when he claimed he could hear what Pokemon were feeling, he actually could. Raised away from other humans, surrounded from childhood by creatures that had been starved, beaten, and burned out by careless trainers, N grew up learning their language before he ever really learned to trust people. That's not a backstory detail tucked in for flavor, that's the whole engine of the character, the reason everything he does later in this story makes a horrible kind of sense. Every other name wearing a Team Plasma uniform was reciting a script somebody handed them. N believed it. He looked at a starved Growlithe or an abandoned Munna and felt something real, and Team Plasma took that real thing and put a crown on it. He got announced to all of Unova as their king, the chosen champion of Pokemon liberation, the face on every poster and every rally they staged. Zero cynicism in him, just a boy who wanted every mistreated creature in the world to stop hurting, standing in front of thousands of people, who had no idea that was the entire plan from the start. That's what makes the next part land so hard. The man Team Plasma actually answered to wasn't N. It was Ghetsis, and Ghetsis didn't build a movement to free Pokemon at all. He built a monopoly, plain and simple, and a monopoly needs a believer standing in front of it so nobody looks at the man pulling the strings behind him. That's the same cold arithmetic running underneath the whole operation, just wearing a different face this time. Ghetsis took N in, raised him in isolation, surrounded by exactly the kind of suffering that would radicalize him, and let that suffering do all the persuading on its own. He didn't need to convince N of anything. He just needed to control what N saw, and he had years to do it right. Walk through what that actually means. A child grows up watching abuse on a loop, gets told he's special because he can hear the pain firsthand, and gets crowned king of the one group, promising to end it forever. Of course he believed. He was engineered to believe, raised like a crop instead of a son. Every trainer he battled, every speech he gave about Pokemon deserving freedom was Ghetsis using a genuine heart as a delivery system for a hostile takeover of an entire region. And here's the part that turns the whole thing upside down. The only member of Team Plasma who wanted actual liberation was also the only one living inside a cage built specifically for him. Sages lied for status, grunts followed orders because orders paid, and just wanted to save something, anything, and the cost was never once realizing he was the thing that needed saving most. That crown only worked because the boy wearing it never questioned who put it there. So when the whole illusion finally cracked apart, Team Plasma didn't need someone who believed anymore. It needed someone who didn't feel a thing, someone who only cared what could be measured, tested, and proven under laboratory conditions. Cole Reese. Cole Reese never once uses the word liberation, not a single time. After the emotional wreckage of watching a boy raised in a cage believe he was a king, that silence is almost a relief. But that relief is the trap. When the original Team Plasma collapses, the movement doesn't die, it splits. One faction clings to the old ideology, still muttering about freeing Pokemon from their trainers. The other faction falls in behind a new acting boss, a researcher with zero interest in liberation, coexistence, or any of the speeches Getz has spent years writing for other people to say. Colress just wants to know how strong a Pokemon can get and what happens if you push past the ceiling. That sounds almost refreshing. No manipulation, no cult logic, no boy in a throne room being told he's chosen. Just a man in a lab coat asking a question, one experiment at a time, like he stumbled into world domination on the way to a peer-reviewed journal. Except the question itself is the same machine wearing a new face. Strip away Gets's talk of oppression and injustice, and you're left with the actual mechanism that was running underneath it the entire time. Control, dressed up as curiosity instead of morality. Colress runs experiments on maximizing raw Pokemon strength, treating trainers and their teams less like people with partners, and more like datasets waiting to be optimized. He doesn't need anyone to believe in a cause. He doesn't need a devoted true believer convinced he's saving the world. He just needs subjects. And that's exactly why he ends up more efficient than everything that came before him. Gets's needed ends sincerity to make the whole operation function in the first place. Colress doesn't need sincerity at all. He just needs a clipboard and something to test it on. Think about what that actually means. The most sympathetic sounding leader Team Plasma ever produced is also the clearest proof the ideology was disposable from the start. You can rip out the moral core entirely, the speeches about mistreated Pokemon, the whole liberation theater built around a boy who never learned he was the one being mistreated, and the organization still runs, still recruits, still functions exactly the same, just with a different justification stapled to the front of it. Fans tend to like Colress. He's not cruel the way Ghetsis is cruel. He's not tragic the way N is tragic. He's curious, almost boyish about it, more interested in strength than suffering. It's easy to read him as the good Plasma boss, the one who just got swept into something bigger than him. But strip away the charm and look at what he's actually doing day to day, running the exact same machine, just minus the mask that made it look like a cause worth crying over. That's the real turn. Ghetsis needed the mask because he needed a believer standing behind him. Colress doesn't wear one because by the time he takes over, the belief was never the point to begin with. It was only ever the leash. Colress just proved you could hold that leash without bothering to hide it anymore. Zero speeches required, but the man in the lab was a replacement brought in after the fall, not the architect of any of it. Behind the founder from the very beginning stood a hidden circle of elders, and only one of them refused to let go when everything came apart. Zinzolin. 6 old men walked away from Team Plasma the moment the truth finally came out. One did not, just one. That single detail is the entire story of Zinzolin. And honestly, it is more damning than anything he actually says or does on screen. He is one of the 7 sages the Council of Elders Ghetsis assembled from across the region to give his Kon the weight of scripture. Rubbed, ancient, and treated like living proof that Team Plasma was something bigger than one man's ambition. That was always the point of the sages. That was the entire design behind the concept. A single villain monologuing about liberation is easy to distrust. Everyone has met a guy like that. But 7 of them, spread across 7 different cities, all repeating the exact same gospel with the exact same conviction, starts to look like a movement instead of a scam. It was never a movement, it was a cover story, with 6 extra faces stapled onto it for credibility. And Zinzolin is the one face that never cracked under pressure. When the split happened, when the rest of the inner circle finally looked at what they had actually built and could not stomach it anymore, Zinzolin stayed exactly where he was. He is documented as the only one of the 7 sages who remains loyal to Ghetsis once the organization fractures in 2, standing with the faction built entirely around the founder, instead of joining the reformers trying to walk the whole thing back, and everyone else in that room got the same information at the same time, everyone else looked at the same wreckage, and every single one of them made a different choice than he did. Zinzolin looked at the evidence that broke 6 other men, 6 men who had presumably lived just as long and seen just as much, and decided the man mattered more than the damage he caused. That is not much of a character arc. If we are being honest, it is barely a character at all. Zinzolin does not get the memorable lines or the dramatic reveal or the tearful realization scene. He gets remembered. On the rare occasion he is remembered at all as the answer to exactly one question: who stayed? Compare that to what you already know about the boy at the center of all this, the one told he was royalty while he was actually being raised inside a cage built specifically to keep him useful. If a supposedly wise old man could look directly at Ghetsis and choose him anyway, knowing everything he knew, imagine what that exact same pull did to a child who had absolutely nothing else in his life to measure it against. Nothing in the sources spells out why Zinzolin stayed while the other 6 walked, but follow what his loyalty proves on its own because it proves plenty. A cause that only ever needed obedience never actually needed 6 sages sitting around believing in it. It needed exactly 1, to prove that belief itself was replaceable. Ghetsis kept the one man who would never ask a single question again, and let the rest scatter into whatever was left of their consciences. That is the real function of the 7 sages, and it is why Zinzolin's thin resume is somehow the most honest resume in the entire organization. He was not there to think. Thinking was never the job. He was there to nod, to lend one more wrinkled, trustworthy face to whatever Ghetsis said next. And when the whole machine finally broke down in front of everyone watching, nodding turned out to be the only skill he had left to offer. The other 6 discovered somewhere along the way that they had consciences after all. Zinzolin discovered he did not need one. Add that to the list, but if one elder proved the founder's pull by staying, the others proved something heavier by leaving. They walked away from the machine they helped build with their own hands and spent the rest of their lives trying to undo it. Rude. Rude spent his life building a cage, then spent the years after trying to bend the bars back. That is not redemption. That is damage control with better lighting. Rude is one of the 7 sages, the executive tier Ghetsis, handpicked from the smartest people he could find across the region, the elders who sat above the grunts and the knights, and every masked follower shouting about liberation in the streets. This was not the public-facing operation N walked through, believing every word of it. N heard slogans. Rude heard the real plan. This was the boardroom. The people who knew what the company actually sold and who signed off on selling it anyway. When the machine finally cracked, the sages split with it. Some elders stayed loyal to Ghetsis out of pure devotion, the kind of loyalty that survives even after the man reveals exactly what he used them for. Rude went the other way. He is remembered as one of the reformed sages, the ones who turned their backs on Ghetsis and spent what came after trying to undo some fraction of the damage. Compare that to the loyalists for a second. Their devotion already proved the cause never needed real belief to keep running, just obedience. Rude proves something colder. He is the version of Team Plasma that understood exactly what it was building and helped build it anyway. That is worse than ignorance. Ignorance gets a pass, knowledge does not. Here is the problem with the redemption label. You cannot unhelp construct something. Rude did not stumble into Team Plasma as a confused teenager who got swept up in a slogan and a costume. He was an executive. He sat in the room where the decisions got made. Whatever atonement looks like for him, it starts from the position of a man who already helped assemble the cage before he decided he did not like the shape of it. And somewhere underneath every one of those executive decisions was one specific kid who never got a vote. Rude helped run an organization built around a boy raised in isolation and told he was royalty when he was actually the machine's most valuable asset. Reforming after the fact does not unhappen that. It just means the man in charge finally noticed what he had done. Fans still argue about how much blame a reformed sage actually carries. Nothing in the story hands down a verdict on Rude specifically, no courtroom scene, no formal reckoning, no closing statement. But follow the pattern anyway. An executive who watches an operation exploit a child and only grows a conscience once the operation collapses around him is not purely a good guy who got tricked. He is a guilty man who eventually did the math, and the math only worked in his favor because the company he helped run had already fallen apart. But atonement is a thing reserved for the members big enough to have done real damage in the first place. Most of the elders never got a redemption arc or a villain arc, or any arc at all. Some are barely more than a name on the roster, remembered for nothing except which side of the split they landed on. And that emptiness is its own kind of clue. Bronius. Try to describe Bronius without checking a wiki first. Most people can't do it. That failure is not a research gap, it is the entire design working exactly as intended. He is one of the 7 sages, the ruling council sitting above everyone else in Team Plasma, and he still barely registers as a character. Gorm gets remembered as the one N argued with, Zinzolin gets remembered for his knights and his sneer. Bronius gets remembered as, well, one of the other guys in the robes. Nobody mixes up the grunts standing on street corners handing out pamphlets. Plenty of people mix up the 7 men who actually ran the show, and that mix-up is not an accident of memory. It is a feature nobody noticed was a feature. That roster is the whole point. Gorm, Bronius, Rude, Zinzolin, Giallo, Ryoku, and one final name that towers over the rest of them. 7 sages, 1 throne, and Bronius fills a chair in that cabinet without ever pulling focus. He sits inside the internal machinery of Plasma, the part that never touches a camera or a crowd, while the public face of the entire operation gets handed to a boy in a castle who thinks he is a king. Bronius does not need to be memorable. He needs to be present, nod at the right moments, and disappear back into the row of identical robes the second the cameras look away. That is not bad writing. That is the same trick every good con runs, just executed at the scale of an entire region. You do not remember your bank's compliance department. You remember the ad with the nice music playing over it. Bronius is compliance. He is the guy in the back room, making sure the machine keeps turning, while somebody prettier stands out front, collecting the applause. And back rooms are not supposed to be interesting. That is the entire job description. Think about what it actually takes to keep 7 separate elders quiet, coordinated, and loyal to a lie that enormous. One liar with a good speech can convince a crowd for an afternoon. 7 liars in matching robes can convince an entire region for years, because a council looks like consensus, and consensus looks like truth. Bronius being forgettable is not a flaw in that plan. It is the plan itself, working exactly as designed, one quiet nod at a time. A boy who wanted to free every mistreated Pokemon on the planet was standing at the top of that structure, believing 7 wise men had gathered around him because his cause mattered to them. Really, they gathered around him because a cause needs elders to make it look legitimate, and elders work best when nobody can tell them apart. Gorm already showed us the Reformists knew exactly what they were building. Bronius shows us how much bigger that build actually was. Not one lieutenant standing behind the throne. A whole layer of them, interchangeable, unremarkable, and stacked like insulation between the public and the man, actually pulling every string. Zero fans argue about Bronius's motivations online, because Bronius was never built to have any that anyone would notice or debate. He existed to be one more robe in a room full of robes, one more nod in a council that always nodded in the same direction, at the same time, for the same reasons nobody ever bothered to ask about. That is not a character flaw. That is the whole assignment, completed perfectly. And if one faceless elder proves there was a whole cabinet standing behind the throne, the last of them proves exactly why that cabinet had to exist in the first place. A movement that screamed about freeing every living thing on the planet needed a wall of nobodies tall enough that the public never thought to look past it and ask the one question that mattered: who actually wasn't free? Gorm. Quiz any Pokemon fan about Team Plasma and you'll get N instantly. Getsis, almost as fast. Maybe Zinzolin if they're paying attention. Ask about Gorm and you'll get silence. Not confusion, not a guess, just silence. That silence is the whole point. Gorm is one of the 7 sages the Executive Council gets is personally built out of Bronius, Rude, Zinzolin, Giallo, Ryoku, himself, and Gorm. 7 old men in matching robes pulled together from across Unova to run an operation that supposedly existed to free Pokemon from human ownership. Gorm never gets a defining scene. He never gets a signature line fans quote back at each other. He never gets a moment where the camera, so to speak, lingers on him. He shows up, he wears the robe, he stands in formation, and that's basically the entire file on him. Compare that to what you already know about the others. Rude walked away from Team Plasma and paid for it with his own brother's contempt. Zinzolin held the ideology so tightly he snapped when Getsis discarded him like an old glove. Even Bronius got remembered as the forgettable one, which at least made him memorable for being forgettable. Gorm doesn't even get that consolation prize. He is, by design or by accident, the least interesting man in an organization built entirely on spectacle. And that's exactly why he matters more than almost anyone else in this video. Because Gorm proves something the flashier members simply can't. Team Plasma was never one charismatic man shouting about liberation while the world watched. It was never just Getsis, and it was never just N standing on a stage in Chargestone Cave looking like a prophet who wandered in from another game. It was a full shadow cabinet, 7 interchangeable elders whose entire function was to exist in bulk. Rude and Bronius could be sympathetic. Zinzolin and Ryoku could be loyal fanatics. Giallo could be the doubter in the corner. But you needed a Gorm too. Someone with no arc, no rebellion, no betrayal, just presence. A wall doesn't need a personality, it needs mass. And that's what the 7 sages actually were, underneath all the robes and ceremony. Not 7 individual believers with 7 individual stories. 7 identical bricks in a wall built around one boy. Every sage in this video, from Rude's quiet guilt to Ryoku's blind obedience to Gorm's total blankness, existed to keep the public's eyes pointed outward. Outward at cruelty toward Pokemon. Outward at the idea of a liberation movement sweeping the region. Outward at N as the shining face of something bigger than himself. Nobody was ever supposed to look inward at the actual boy inside that castle, raised since infancy surrounded by Pokemon that had been deliberately hurt so he'd believe cruelty was universal. He was told he was chosen, he was told he was basically royalty, he was, in the most literal sense, available to a children's game, kept in a cage and handed a crown so he'd never once check for bars. Gorm never guarded a treasure vault or a throne room. None of the sages did. They guarded a blind spot. 7 old men in robes standing in a loose circle around one teenager's ignorance, making sure the boy in the middle never noticed he was the only thing actually being contained. Team Plasma promised freedom to an entire region and delivered it to exactly one prisoner, and it was never a Pokemon at all. It was the boy Ghetsis built from scratch and called a king, surrounded on every side by men whose only real job was making sure he never looked down and saw the chains. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.